Hey, this is Bill Van Loo. It's been a long time coming, but today I'm really excited to share with you the third and final part of my workshop redo series. This is my back workbench and my miter saw station that I made almost entirely from reclaimed material for almost no cost whatsoever. Check it out. I knew that I wanted to use this cabinet as the left side of my back workbench and miter saw station, but the previous homeowners had covered them with this really lovely contact paper. So the first order of business with this cabinet was to get the pulls off and to get all of the contact paper cleaned off of there. And my initial thought was that once I had taken the contact paper off and stripped the paint down, that I would actually go ahead and repaint it. But what I realized was that once I got the contact paper and this layer of yellow paint off, that the cabinet itself was painted this sort of off green that I really kind of liked. Okay, it kind of was a retro sort of vintage industrial vibe, and I decided I kind of liked it, so I think I'm going to leave it for now. The process of building the back workbench itself really began with preparing stock for the top workbench surfaces. And my goal was to use as much reclaimed material as possible in here. So the first step was getting some of the old shelves cut down into strips. And I really wasn't quite sure what kind of wood this is, and I really am still not sure. But once I got a first cut made through here, I looked at it, and I really like it, and it's fairly lightweight, but I like the color and the texture, and I think it will actually work out pretty well. So I set up the table saw and started ripping down strips, and each of these strips ended up being 1.5 inches wide, because what I wanted to do was to use, those to basically glue up and laminate together a big butcher block style workbench top. So there was a ton of time spent preparing stock for this. Ripping down all of those pieces into 1.5 inch strips. You can see some that are done there and some that I'm still in the process of doing. I essentially had 3 categories of material. I had the old shelves that I was ripping down. I had these pieces of oak, which were from oak planks, and you'll see more of those later. I had a little bit of pallet wood. And then right towards the very end, I ended up finding that I just didn't have quite enough width to make it all the way across there. So I was lucky enough to come across some really nice reclaimed Douglas fir 2x4s that were sort of premium quality that I was able to take and rip down into strips as well. So by the time I had those 3 sets of things ripped down, the shelves, the oak planks, and those 2x4s, I had this sort of mixed series of different kinds of woods that I could lay out into strips, trim the ends off with at the miter saw station, and then basically lay out into a butcher block style workbench top. And there was a lot of work in sort of jigsawing all of this stuff together, getting all the ends lined up so that everything lined up square and true. A lot of this stock, because it was reclaimed, had knots and holes, so I had to trim off some of that stuff. But once it was finally laid out, I could do a really massive glue up. And for starters, I ended up doing this in 3 sections. So what you see me doing right here is gluing up the sections of oak and pallet wood that I used. And I decided I wanted that to be the front part of the workbench countertop. Basically because I figured it would be the most durable. And this just was a really long process of laying glue out and getting things in there. I used, I think, every clamp that I had and could borrow, and you can see it all in the clamps there right now. One thing I wish I had done differently during this process is work more with cauls. You can see one kind of clamping caul on the right side there to really keep things perfectly flat, but this was by far my biggest glue up I'd ever done. I also needed to do the same thing to make a top surface for the miter saw station, which I wanted to have as a separate piece so it could be recessed and so that the bed of the miter saw would be flush with the top of the workbench top. So once I had those pieces glued up, I could take them over to the crosscut sled and trim off the extra pieces from the edges there. And you can see me doing that here. And I ended up with 3 sections for the miter saw station and 3 big sections glued up for the main workbench countertop piece as well. Because I don't own a planer in my workshop, I was actually really lucky to be able to go over to Cultivate, where I had been doing a little volunteering over the summer, and to use a planer that they had set up in their space. They have a really nice DeWalt planer, and I was able to take all 3 of those big sections and all 3 of those small sections for the miter saw station and run them through the planer. And I had made them in 3 separate sections specifically so that they would fit through the width of a planer. If I had tried to put them all together into one massive section at first, there's no way they would have done that. The next step in actually building the workbench itself was to rip down these oak planks into essentially 2x4 material for the legs. I had used some of this oak plank material in making the top itself before, but I'd left some out so that I would have these big beefy sections to use as legs. Because these are so big and so heavy, it made a lot more sense to use the circular saw with a rip guide to try to cut these down to size instead of trying to shove these through the table saw. These are pretty hefty pieces, and the circular saw actually made really short work of this. I was actually very pleasantly surprised by how well that rip guide on the circular saw worked for getting these cut down into size. I tried as hard as I could to use just reclaimed material in this project, but I wasn't able to quite get away with that, so I did buy a little bit of new material. I bought some 2x6s that I ripped in half and then angled at the miter saw to basically create a skirt or a frame that all of this would be assembled onto. So here I'm marking out those 45-degree miters, which will form the corners of the top skirt and the middle skirt or frame for the workbench station as well. And you'll see me assembling those in just a second here. This was really lightweight wood, and it was kind of an interesting contrast working with this and the really beefy oak planks. But thankfully the worktop and the oak legs give a ton of strength and stability to this structure, so this was really just kind of there to tie everything together. Here you can see me laying out one of those frames, and it was really just 4 pieces with miter joints at the sides and then some stringers through the middle to provide some extra support and stability for the workbench top. One thing that I did a lot of during this project was trying to visualize exactly how it would work as it all came together. So I ended up using a bunch of quick clamps to basically clamp things into place so that I could sort of visualize it without having to try and draw out every single step or make a 3D model of it. And that visualization process actually really helped me a lot in figuring out how I wanted everything to come together. What I'm doing here is countersinking some holes and getting ready to attach the legs themselves to what will actually be the top of the workbench. It's laid on the floor right now so that I could get that drilled and marked in the appropriate places. But I'm using one of those legs as a reference and to drill and countersink and drill pilot holes so that I can attach the legs to the actual frame. Once the legs are attached, then the whole thing will get flipped over, of course. Getting these screws in was a pretty quick process with the impact driver, although the square head screws that I used really stick to the driver bit from the impact driver. I did need to trim up some pieces to act as in-betweens for the 2 legs, and I added those really to increase the rigidity of the structure. So I got those into place and used a little square to help make sure that they were lined up, and then got some pilot holes drilled and got some screws added. I did not go with particularly fancy fasteners for this one. I had originally thought about doing some more intricate joinery, in fact, about trying to do some mortise and tenon style joinery, and I realized that I was running out of time for the summer, and I really just didn't want to take on that extra challenge, although doing more traditional mortise and tenon style joinery is something that I want to try and do in the future. It just really didn't work out time-wise for this project. I was more interested in getting the bench built so that I would have it to work at than trying that new technique for this particular project. So it's really just countersunk holes and screws holding everything together. You can see me adding another piece of that skirting to the support that goes between the legs there, and this is really just there to increase the rigidity of the bench. One thing I did think about was possibly adding drawers or possibly cabinet doors, so that middle skirt will be a nice place to support additional shelves, for example. As I went to assemble the pieces of the workbench top together, I got some advice from a friend of mine to try to use threaded rod to hold the pieces together. His concern was that with the disparate types of wood that I used, that they might delaminate with the changes in humidity and temperature. And because this workbench is in my garage, which is not heated or insulated, that was a very real concern. So I decided to try and do this, and this process was honestly pretty tricky and kind of fiddly. I really, in some ways, wish I hadn't gone this route. Instead probably trying to borrow a biscuit joiner or something like that. But what I ended up doing was marking 3 locations in each of the pieces of the workbench top and drilling those out with a little homemade drilling guide that I put together. And my thought was that I would drill from one side using the longest bit that I have, which is from a Craig pocket hole set. It's a long drill bit, and it's almost the exact same diameter as the threaded rod. So my thought was that I would drill the hole, and then I could remove the drilling guide and even drill a little bit further down to really maximize the length of that bit. But even with that, it didn't quite make it all the way through, so I did have to flip the pieces over and try to drill them out from the other side. This process was difficult. So you can see me putting the threaded rod in there, and it did fit from that side, and it did fit at that point, but you'll start to see the difficulties multiply a little bit later on. So I'm using that homemade drilling guide here to drill out each side and then marking the other side after it's been flipped over and drilling it back from that side as well. I was able to get a couple of sections threaded together on that threaded rod, but then this last section just wouldn't go. And once I finally did sort of convince it to go in with the rubber mallet, it really turned out that it was just not lined up well. And I realized that the issue here was that I was trying to use the threaded rod for aligning the pieces, and what I really needed to do was use the threaded rod just to provide essentially infinite or long-lasting clamping pressure in keeping those parts held together so they wouldn't delaminate. So the net result of that was that I ended up making the hole for the threaded rod a bit bigger than the diameter of the rod itself, so it wasn't such a precision fit, top to bottom, so to speak, in the rod, but that I was able to just use the rod as a way to hold the pieces together. And once I did that, that made the whole process a lot simpler, but it was a long process of drilling and getting that in place. But once I got the threaded rods there, I did some glue up and got the 6 big sections that I ended up with glued together, and then trimmed off the ends of the threaded rod with a hacksaw and cleaned them up a little bit with the random orbit sander so there weren't any sharp edges or burrs there. This is where I wish I had an angle grinder. I did also need to trim off the ends of the workbench, and for this I decided to just use a level with the circular saw clamped on. This first cut worked out just great. The second cut, well, not so much, and you'll see what I mean. That fun shower of sparks you just saw was me cutting the cord of the circular saw with the circular saw. At least the cut was finished when it was done. I guess I have some repair work to do. Thankfully, I wasn't injured in any way during that whole experience. It was just scary and a little bit, made me feel a little bit foolish. But I did manage to get both of the ends trimmed off, and then I could just get the workbench top set into place, and it was a fantastic feeling seeing this all come seeing it all come together once it had gotten to this point. I knew I still needed to attach it to the frame, but just seeing it in place for the first time felt really good. I did do some cleanup in terms of sanding down both the miter bench surface as well as the main workbench surface, first with a 3rd sheet sander and then with the random orbit sander. And after I had done a little bit of surface prep, I needed to actually get it attached. So I decided to use these corner braces to try to allow for some expansion and contraction of the wood to some degree. And this is a place where I still feel like I'm really learning about wood movement, but I think that this will work out pretty well, and I can always take it off easily later on because it's just held down by these corner braces here. So I put 2 corner braces at each leg for a total of 8, and these are just screwed into the workbench top from above and to the legs from the side. I used 2 coats of polyurethane on both the miter saw top as well as the bench top as well. After that finish was applied, I used paste finishing wax to give it just a final coat and to really lock everything in. I'm really pleased with how this part of it turned out. I love the feel and the look of the surface of the finished product, especially once I buffed everything out. I did want to have plenty of power at the back workbench, so I did also buy a long multi-outlet extension or power strip. This is just from Harbor Freight, and it was maybe $20 if memory serves right. A couple of screws attached this to the back pallet wood wall, and I used those 2x4s as spacers to really just make sure that it was at a consistent height off of the workbench, and so it wasn't just laying on the workbench itself. And that worked out really nicely to use those in that way. Once everything was attached with the power strip, I was able to remove those and then do a little cord management and actually start bringing tools back in, which was super, super exciting. So you can see me putting the drill press and the miniature bandsaw back in place, getting a little bit of power management done, and then I could bring the miter saw in. Now, one thing that I didn't really do yet, that I'm still planning on doing is some kind of alignment system, whether it be bench dogs or a more permanent solution for fastening the miter saw to the miter saw station in place so that it was perfectly parallel to the other table. So I'm thinking about doing a series of bench dogs, holes in the main workbench, for example, to hold on a 90-degree fence, extension fence for the miter saw, so that I could slide the other tools out of the way. You can see for a shorter piece of trim this works just fine, but for longer, bigger pieces I'd like a little more support on the workbench itself, and I think a removable fence might be the way to go. Overall, I am super thrilled with this. The back workbench has proven really useful already, and I can't wait to keep using it more in the future. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, subscribe to my YouTube channel or check me out on Instagram @BillVanLoo.